Okay, so I want you to picture the scene. It's probably the most famous moment of betrayal in all of Western
It
history.
has to be.
We're in a garden. It's nighttime. You've got these torches flickering,
Yep.
right? Casting these long, kind of jagged shadows behind the olive trees. And then the moment happens.
Yes,
The kiss on the cheek.
exactly. And with that one single gesture, this man, Judas Iscariot, he becomes the ultimate villain, the archetype for treachery for 2,000 years. We all know this story. We know who the hero is, and we absolutely know who the bad guy is.
It is the foundational narrative of betrayal.
Yeah.
It really is. It sets up this binary, this good versus evil, loyalty versus treason that it's seeped into everything. Art,
Yeah.
literature, our own moral compass.
That's the bedrock. Yeah, it's a story you kind of absorb through osmosis. You don't even have to read it to know it. But
Yeah.
what if we've been reading it wrong?
And I don't mean just like a little bit wrong, not like we missed a detail about the weather or something. I mean, what if the entire premise of that relationship, what if it was never about two men fighting? What if it wasn't even about betrayal at all?
Well, that is the huge question we're tackling today, isn't it? And I have to say, the research stack you've pulled for this deep dive it's radical. It's asking us to completely invert our whole understanding of how these ancient stories were even supposed to work.
It really is.
We're looking at a hypothesis that says these ancient texts, they were never meant to be read as, history in the first place.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory when you put it like that, doesn't
It does a little, yeah.
But when you look at these sources, and we're talking about, cognitive anthropology, systems theory, some really deep textual analysis of the Gospel of Judas,
Yeah.
this isn't about finding some secret history. It's not a Da Vinci Code thing.
No, not at all. It's about what they call a structural decoding.
Right, and that distinction feels really important to make right from the start.
It's vital. We are not rewriting history here. We're not saying, actually, here's what really happened that night. What we're looking at is a hypothesis that these texts, especially the Gnostic ones, they functioned as psychological technologies.
Psychological technologies, I love that phrase.
And the source material argues that in these specific texts, Jesus and Judas are not two separate historical figures. They are, and this is the quote, symbolically differentiated poles within a unified ontological system.
Okay, symbolically differentiated poles within a unified ontological system.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful.
It is a bit of a mouthful, yeah.
But if I'm parsing that correctly, it's saying they're two parts of the same, what?
The same system. It's the same mind?
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
The core idea we're exploring is that the text isn't a news report from Jerusalem around 30 AD. It's a map.
A map.
A map of the human mind. And on this map, the figure of Jesus represents one part of your consciousness, and the figure of Judas represents another. And their story, their interaction, isn't a feud. It's a process. It's a mechanism. So wait, when Judas hands Jesus over, it's not treason. It's, a system update. Is that what we're saying?
That's a surprisingly good way to put it, actually. It's a dramatization of ego transformation. But look, before we get into the nuts and bolts of how that works, we really need to set the stage with the main research hypothesis. The sources call this the Jesus-Judas dyad.
A dyad. So a pair that functions as a single unit, like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. They can't exist without each other. Their meaning is created by their relationship. And the sources are incredibly strict about the scope. We have to be crystal clear for you listening. This research is not claiming that historically the man Jesus and the man Judas were literally one person.
Right. No Fight Club twist where he's punching himself in a parking lot.
Precisely. We are not talking about historical identity. This is about structural identity within a narrative. The claim is that these ancient myth makers were far more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They were using characters to encode very complex truths about how the human psyche works and develops.
And they had their own terminology for this. You mentioned it. We've got things like isomorphic holism and dialogic compression. It honestly sounds like we're about to analyze a piece of computer code.
And that's actually a really helpful analogy, seriously. Think of the story as a compressed file, a zip file.
Yeah.
Dialogic compression means the authors took these massive amounts of data, ontology, ethics, psychology, cosmology, and they compressed it all into a simple dialogue between two characters. Our job, and really the whole mission of this deep dive, is to unzip that file and see what the code actually does.
I love that. So we're looking at the Gospel of Judas not as some, heretical text that the early church tried to burn, but as a piece of ancient software, a program designed to run on the human brain.
That is the absolute core of the isomorphic holism hypothesis. The idea that the structure of the story perfectly matches, or is intended to match, the structure of the mind. Isomorphic just means same shape.
Same shape. The story is shaped like your soul. Okay, I am completely hooked. If the story is shaped like my soul, then who am I in this drama? Am I supposed to be Jesus? Am I Judas?
Well, according to this model, you're
Oh.
both. And that right there is where it gets really, really interesting. So let's get into part 1 of our outline, the architecture of the soul. We need to break down exactly what these two figures represent on this internal map.
All right, let's start with the big one, the protagonist. In the story we all know, Jesus is the Son of God, the Savior. In this structural decoding, what is he?
So in this framework, the Jesus figure represents what they call integrated consciousness, or if you want to use the Gnostic term, gnosis-informed awareness. This is the part of you that is connected to the divine source, the part that sees the big picture. It's the self with a capital S.
The highest version of ourself, the enlightened part.
Mm.
Maybe the observer that's watching the thoughts go by.
Yes, that's a great way to think of it. But here's the problem that the ancients understood very well. Pure consciousness, pure spirit, it can't really interact with the material world on its own terms. It's too abstract. For that capital S self to be fully realized in a human life, it has to deal with the ego.
And that's where Judas comes in.
That is exactly where Judas comes in.
So Judas is the ego. Just
More specifically, the sources call Judas the transitional ego, or, and this is a key term, the demiurgic ego structure.
Okay, demiurgic. That is a very specific Gnostic word. The demiurge was the craftsman god, right? The one who builds the physical world, but is kind of flawed, isn't he? He's not the ultimate god.
Exactly right. He's the builder. And the ego is the builder. It builds your identity. It builds your defenses. It constructs the you that has to navigate the social and material world, your job, your reputation, your sense of being a separate individual person. That is the Judas function.
So it's not evil then, not in this model.
Not at all. It's necessary. It's absolutely essential. You need an ego to function in the world. You need a container for your consciousness to operate in.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't just be a floating ball of divine light. You have to pay taxes. You have to introduce yourself at parties. You need a Judas to handle the day-to-day logistics of being a person.
You absolutely do. But
Okay.
the central action of the story is that Judas betrays Jesus. So on this internal map, why does the ego have to betray the self?
This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If Judas is my necessary interface with the world, my operating system, why does he have to turn on me? Why does that function have to lead to a betrayal?
And this is where the entire model does a 180 on the traditional story.
Yeah.
The source material argues, and I'm quoting here, betrayal functions as identity surrender.
Identity surrender. Okay, unpack that for me. That sounds big.
Think about it in your own life. For you to grow, to truly, profoundly grow, whether it's psychologically or spiritually, you have to let go of who you think you are.
Right.
Of course.
You have to shed a skin.
Exactly. You have to dismantle the identity you've so carefully built. The ego, which is Judas, has to consciously hand over the self, which is Jesus, to be transformed, to be in the story, crucified and reborn.
So the betrayal isn't a stabbing in the back. It's a handoff. It's a conscious act of release.
It's a necessary sacrifice. And the source analysis points out something crucial. If you read the Gospel of Judas, the text itself, it's profoundly different from the New Testament Gospels we're used to.
Oh, so?
Well, for one, Jesus and Judas are often depicted alone, having these deep, private conversations. Jesus laughs with him. He shares mysteries with Judas that he doesn't share with the other disciples.
The sources mention that Jesus shows foreknowledge and a real intimacy with Judas. There's no hostility there.
Right. And if you read that as a historical account of a guy planning a murder, it makes zero sense. Why would Jesus hang out with his own assassin and teach him the secrets of the universe?
Yeah, it'd be like a bank manager giving the robber the combination to the vault over coffee. It's absurd.
It's completely absurd. But if you read it as an internal process, a dialogue between the self and the ego, it makes perfect sense. The integrated self is instructing the ego on what needs to happen next for the whole system to evolve. It's saying, look, you have to turn me in. You have to break this vessel so that light can get out.
That completely reframes the whole condemnation of Judas. I mean, he is the most hated figure in history. But in this model, that condemnation isn't a punishment for being a bad person.
No, It's not a moral judgment. The condemnation, the suffering of Judas represents the cost of that surrender. When you let go of your ego structure, I mean, think about any major life change, a spiritual awakening, changing careers, ending a long relationship. It feels like a death.
It does. It feels like you're being condemned.
You lose your standing. You lose your certainty. You lose who you thought you were. The ego suffers immensely so that the self can ascend. Judas has to go through his own hell for Jesus to be resurrected.
That is. Wow, that's heavy. But it's also incredibly relatable.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about that extended developmental framing the source talks about. They lay out this specific sequence. It goes persona, then rupture, then instruction, surrender, and finally integration.
Let's walk through that because it really grounds this high-flying theory in, lived experience. Everyone starts with a persona. That's the mask you wear. That's the early stage Judas. You think that you are your job title, your social status, your roles.
Right. I am a podcaster. I am a doctor. I am a parent. That's the structure I've built to define myself.
Then comes the rupture. Something happens, a crisis, a failure, maybe just a quiet dawning realization that the mask isn't fitting anymore. The life you've built feels hollow.
The dark night of the soul.
Precisely. In the narrative, this is often where the conflict begins. The ego starts to struggle, it sees its own limitations, and it's terrifying.
Okay, then instruction.
This is the internal dialogue. The deeper voice, the Jesus voice, starts telling the ego, the Judas voice, hey, there is more to this reality than you currently understand. In the text itself, this is literally Jesus pulling Judas aside and explaining the cosmos to him. He's educating the ego on why it needs to step aside.
Preparing it for the final act, which is the surrender.
The kiss in the garden. The moment the ego finally stops fighting the process and agrees to it, okay, I will give you up. I will let this structure I've built collapse for the sake of something greater.
And finally, integration. The transformation is complete. A new, more expanded self is born.
A self that now includes the wisdom of the old one but isn't limited by it.
The source makes a really fascinating point here about the transitional ego. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, that without the transitional structure, transformation is impossible.
That is so key. You cannot transcend an ego you don't have. You need the Judas figure. You have to build a strong, functional identity before you can see its limits and dismantle it. If you don't have a Judas, you have nothing to sacrifice on the altar of transformation.
So Judas isn't the villain, he's the vehicle.
He is the necessary vehicle, and he's the vehicle that must be discarded at the end of the trip. And that's, well, it's tragic in a way. That's why the figure of Judas is always so tragic and compelling. He does the dirty work that makes salvation possible. He's like the booster rocket on a spaceship.
Yeah. It gets the shuttle into orbit.
But it has to burn up and fall back into the ocean. It can't go all the way.
This reminds me of, almost every coming-of-age story, or every story about a midlife crisis. You spend the first half of your life building this powerful Judas structure. I'm a lawyer, I'm a father, I'm successful. And then at some point, for you to keep growing, that structure has to betray itself to let something deeper emerge.
That's a perfect modern analogy. And if you resist that betrayal, if you cling to that Judas identity past its expiration date, you stagnate. You become rigid, bitter. The source argues that the tension in the text between love and betrayal isn't a contradiction, it's a developmental necessity.
You have to love the structure enough to build it.
And then betray it enough to leave it behind for something more.
It changes the whole feeling of that scene in the garden. It's not a crime scene, it's a chrysalis.
That is a beautiful image.
Yeah.
It is. It's a chrysalis breaking open. To the caterpillar, that process must feel like a profound betrayal of everything it knows and is. It's a death. But to the butterfly, it's birth. The caterpillar has to die, has to be betrayed, for the butterfly to exist.
Okay, so that's the dyad, the Jesus-Judas system as an internal process. But I want to zoom out now into the second part of our deep dive, the cognitive framework. Because the sources make a pretty bold claim about why the ancients wrote these kinds of stories in the first place.
Right. This brings us to H5 in the source notes, the isomorphic holism hypothesis.
Holistic cognition.
Yes. And this really gets at a major blind spot we have as modern people. We tend to split everything up. We have a box for psychology, a box for religion, a box for science, and another one for fiction or mythology.
And those boxes rarely touch. If I want to learn about my brain, I go to a neuroscientist. If I want to learn about my soul, I go to a priest or a philosopher.
Correct. But the source argues that the ancient mind, particularly in these esoteric traditions, didn't have those dividers. For them, myth was psychology, story was science. They didn't have a separate academic field called developmental psychology. They had stories about gods and heroes.
And the source has this section I found really grounding, the brain hardware argument, which basically says the human nervous system hasn't changed.
That is the anchor for this whole theory. Physically, biologically, the people who wrote the Gospel of Judas had the exact same brains we do. Same prefrontal cortex, same amygdala. They weren't primitive. They weren't stupid. They weren't just hallucinating because they ate some bad mushrooms.
Right.
They were running different software on the same hardware.
So we haven't gotten smarter. We've just shifted our focus.
We have reweighted our cognitive mode. That's the term they use. Modern life, especially since the Enlightenment, optimizes for analytic differentiation.
Meaning taking things apart.
Yes. We dissect, we categorize, we label, we break everything down into its smallest possible components. Ancient culture, on the other hand, optimized for symbolic integration. They were constantly putting things together. They saw how the patterns in the stars related to the patterns of the crops, which related to the patterns of the soul, which related to the health of the kingdom.
So when we read a myth today and say, well, that's not scientifically accurate, snakes can't talk, we are completely missing the point.
We were committing a massive category error. We're trying to read a poem as if it's a technical manual for a lawnmower. The source calls these myths interior pedagogy.
Pedagogy, meaning a method of teaching.
Exactly. Structured interior pedagogy. These stories were advanced educational systems for the human emotional and spiritual life. They were teaching you, through narrative, how to be a fully realized human being.
There's this section in the source material on mental health accessibility that I just thought was brilliant. It suggests that in the ancient world, therapy wasn't something you went to. It wasn't a clinic you visited for an hour a week.
Right. Today, if you have an ego crisis or an existential dread, you go to a specialist. You pay money. You sit in a quiet room. It's what the source calls professionally specialized. But the hypothesis here is that in a holistic culture, the psychological tools were distributed.
Distributed how?
They were embedded in the culture itself, in the stories, the rituals, the festivals, the songs.
So going to the public square to hear the Gospel of Judas read aloud, that was the therapy session.
Exactly. When you listen to the story of the betrayal, you weren't just hearing some historical gossip about what happened to the disciples. You were participating in a public therapy session for your own ego. You were rehearsing in a safe, symbolic space the necessary and painful process of letting go.
That is so much more efficient, honestly. It's like it democratizes the entire process of healing and growth.
It's culturally embedded.
Right.
You learned how to grieve, how to transition from childhood to adulthood, how to face death, not by reading a self-help book you bought on Amazon, but by participating in the myth. The myth gave you the shared template, the emotional language.
It makes me wonder what we've lost by privatizing all of that. You know, now if you're having an existential crisis, it's treated as a private medical problem. Back then, it was just part of the human story that everyone knew and participated in.
And that shared language is incredibly powerful. If everyone in your culture knows the story of Judas in this way, then everyone has a shorthand for that difficult but necessary moment when I need to let go of my old self. We don't really have that shared shorthand anymore, do we?
No, we really don't. So these stories are narrative technology. But how does the technology actually work? How do you hide a complex psychological map inside a conversation between two guys in sandals? This takes us to part 3, decoding the dialogue.
This is the methodology section. How do they actually build a machine? And the core concept the source introduces is dialogic compression.
We touched on this, the zip file idea. But let's get into the nuts and bolts of it.
Well, let's get technical. The hypothesis is that the dialogue in a text like this is high-density symbolic compression. It's not just chit-chat. Every line is encoded with layers of meaning about ontology, ethics, and identity. But it requires a trained reader to unpack it.
The source mentions the secret aspect. I mean, the Gospel of Judas literally opens with the line, the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas.
Right. In our modern minds, when we hear the word secret, we immediately think of conspiracy. We think of hidden facts like the secret ingredient in the sauce or the secret location of the buried treasure.
The secret they don't want you to know. We think of national treasure or something. We think someone is hiding information.
Exactly. But here, the source makes a brilliant argument that secrecy isn't about hiding facts, it's about the representational mode. The secret is you have to know how to read it.
So it's not hidden, it's just in code.
It's like looking at a blueprint for a skyscraper. If you don't know architecture, that blueprint is a secret to you. Not because it's locked in a safe, but because you can't decode the symbols. You just see a bunch of lines. An architect sees a building.
So the secret of the Gospel of Judas is the literacy required to understand that Judas is a part of you.
Yes. And to understand that the dialogue is polyphonic. This is a term from a literary theorist mentioned in the sources, Mikhail Bakhtin.
Bakhtin and polyphony. Okay, break that down for us.
Polyphony literally means many voices. Bakhtin used it to describe certain novels, he was talking about Dostoevsky, where the characters aren't just puppets for the author's own worldview. They represent fully formed, autonomous, clashing ideologies.
Now, so it's not just the author talking to himself using a bunch of sock puppets. Each character has their own valid, independent voice.
Exactly. It's the author simulating a living debate between worldviews. The source applies the same idea to these Gnostic texts. It says the voices, Jesus and Judas, are structural functions, or, and this is a great phrase, voice as ontology.
Voice as ontology. Ontology being the study of being, of what is. So when Judas speaks, it's not just a guy complaining. It's the voice of a specific state of being, a whole worldview.
Precisely. Judas speaks with the voice of the material, temporal, transitional world, the world of ego and separation. Jesus speaks with the voice of the pneumatic, the spiritual, the eternal world. And the drama of the text is the friction, the dialogue between these two states of being.
The source tells us to look for text internal markers, things that signal this is what's happening. It mentions reversals and mirroring language.
Yes, and if you look at the text closely, it's filled with them. There are all these moments where the expected roles flip. Jesus scoffs at the other disciples in their prayers, but he takes Judas seriously. He pulls him aside, and then he says that famous line, "You will exceed them all, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me."
Sacrifice the man that clothes me. I want to linger on that line. That is so specific and so strange.
It's the smoking gun for this entire theory, isn't it? The man that clothes me is the physical body. It's the public identity. It's the persona. Jesus is explicitly saying, Judas, you are the one who is going to help me get rid of this outer shell, this limitation. That's not betrayal. That's a collaborative mission. It's a perfect mirror image of the hostility and condemnation we see in the canonical Gospels.
So the betrayal isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature.
It is absolutely 100% a feature. The system requires the betrayal to function. Without the betrayal, the shell never breaks, the transformation never happens, and the spirit remains trapped in the old form.
Okay, so if this is such a sophisticated, useful, and powerful psychological tool, why did we lose it? Why is the Gospel of Judas a dusty manuscript someone found in a cave in Egypt and not something we read in Sunday school? That brings us to part 4, why we misunderstood it.
This is where we get into the sociology of knowledge, and it's fascinating. The source identifies 2 main culprits for why this reading was lost. First, H3, the anti-chronological bias.
The snobbery of the present.
It really is. We have this deep-seated, often unconscious assumption that time equals progress. Therefore, older must equal simpler or more primitive. We assume people living in 200 AD were superstitious, fearful, and frankly, not very bright.
We think because they didn't have iPhones, they couldn't possibly have had profound psychological insights. We look back and say, oh, look at those primitive people with their silly myths about talking snakes.
Right. And because of that bias, when we read ancient texts that use words like spirit or breath or demon, we take it all literally. We think they were genuinely scared of invisible monsters hiding under the bed. We commit these massive category errors. We read their symbolic dyads as if they were historical gossip.
We treat it like a tabloid. Did you hear what Judas did to Jesus last night? Instead of, did you understand the symbolic function of the ego's surrender to the self?
Exactly. We completely fail to recognize the genre we're reading. And that failure leads directly to the second culprit, H4, the institutional threat.
This is what the source calls the gatekeeping hypothesis.
Think about it. This method of reading, this structural decoding, it requires interpretation. It requires you to sit with the text, to unpack the symbols, and to apply them to your own psyche.
It's DIY spirituality. You have to do the work yourself. There's no easy answer.
And institutions generally don't love DIY. If the story is just, Judas was a bad man who did a bad thing and you'll be punished if you're like him, that's very easy to control and police. You can build a clear moral code around it. It reinforces a simple binary. Good versus evil, us versus them.
And institutions thrive on binaries. It makes it very clear who's in charge and who you should listen to. We are the good guys and they are the bad guys.
Absolutely. But if Judas and Jesus are 2 necessary parts of the same whole, if the betrayer is actually an essential part of the Savior, Well, that destabilizes everything. It dissolves what the source calls the scapegoat structure.
You can't just blame the bad guy and cast him out anymore. You have to find a way to integrate him.
And that is an existentially dangerous idea for any authority structure that relies on having clear-cut enemies. If the enemy is actually inside you and is necessary for your own growth, then the priest or the bishop or the government can't save you from him. You have to do the work yourself. It moves the locus of salvation from the external institution to the internal self.
The source mentions the reception history pattern and points to the modern academic debates, referencing scholars like Elaine Pagels and Karen King on one side and April DeConnick on the other.
Yes, and we should be careful to represent this fairly because it's a real and important debate. Scholars like Pagels and King have championed this more sympathetic or traditionally Gnostic reading where Judas is an insider helping Jesus. April DeConnick, who is a brilliant Coptic scholar, has argued that the translation of key words might actually point to a much darker interpretation, that the word used for Judas isn't spirit, but is in fact demon.
So the whole thing could hinge on the translation of a single Coptic word, daemon.
It's a huge point of contention. Does daemon mean a spirit in a neutral or good sense, like Socrates' daemon? Or does it mean a demon in the purely negative sense we think of today? But our source material makes an interesting counterpoint here. It suggests that even if DeConnick is right, and the text explicitly calls Judas a demon, within the system of Gnosticism, the demonic or demiurgic force is still the necessary structure that builds the flawed material world.
So even if he is a demon, he's still playing the role of the transitional ego. His function doesn't change.
Exactly. Whether you label that function beloved disciple or necessary demon, his job in the dyad remains the same. He is the force that creates the separation and then must be overcome for integration to happen. So the scholarly conflict over the translation, while important, doesn't necessarily negate the underlying structural hypothesis.
It just changes the tone of the software, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. Is it a friendly system update or is it a painful, terrifying system crash? Either way, the system has to reboot. The function of the code is the same, even if the user interface is a lot scarier.
I like that. Okay, so we have this piece of ancient tech. We have the reasons it was suppressed or misunderstood, because it's complex and it threatens simple authority. Now, part 5, scaling the theory. The source is very clear that this isn't just a one-off. This dyadic structure isn't just about Jesus and Judas.
No, not at all. This is the universal pattern section of the analysis. The argument is that if this hypothesis holds water, that ancient myths are psychological dyads in disguise, then we should be able to see this pattern everywhere. And the source suggests we do.
Let's run through the list they provide. Cain and Abel.
The quintessential story of the rejected self and the accepted self, the part of you that feels its offering is unworthy versus the part that is blessed. It's the story of envy and shadow externalized into two brothers.
Jacob and Esau.
The grasping, clever ego Jacob, whose name means supplanter, versus the raw, hairy, natural man Esau. And Jacob has to wrestle with the angel, with the divine, to be wounded and find his true name, Israel. It's a perfect map of ego transformation.
Krishna and Arjuna, from the Bhagavad Gita.
That is a perfect, explicit example. You have the human warrior, Arjuna, the ego, paralyzed by doubt and confusion on the battlefield of life. And who does he have a dialogue with?
His charioteer, who reveals himself to be Krishna, the divine.
The divine self. It's an externalized conversation between the struggling human ego and the divine inner consciousness happening right in the middle of a battle.
And even the demiurge and Sophia from Gnostic myth itself.
The ultimate dyad in that system. You have wisdom, Sophia, who falls and gives birth to the blind, arrogant builder, the demiurge, who thinks he's the only god. The entire Gnostic drama is about resolving that split between the source of wisdom and the mechanism of creation. They're all relational dyads. They all map an internal conflict onto an external dialogue.
It's like the ancients had a standard template for writing the human operating system manual, and they just changed the character names and the settings for different cultures.
That is the isomorphic argument in a nutshell. The hardware, the human brain and psyche, is fundamentally the same across cultures. So the software, the myth, tends to converge on the same core structures. We keep telling ourselves the same story over and over because we keep having the same internal struggles.
So let's bring it all home. What is the so what? Why does any of this matter to you, listening to this right now? Why does it matter if Judas was part of a structural dyad?
I think it matters profoundly because of the concept of integration. We live in a culture that, for the most part, tells us to fight, suppress, or destroy the bad parts of ourselves, to hide our shadow, to feel shame for the Judas inside us, the part that is greedy or scared or ambitious or feels like a traitor.
We try to excommunicate our own inner Judas. We push him down into the subconscious and pretend he's not there.
We do. We try to be only Jesus, only light, only good, only perfect. But this entire model suggests that that is not only impossible, it's developmentally stalled. You need your Judas structure.
The betrayer is a necessary transitional structure.
Right. And what that means is instead of hating your ego or your past failures or your so-called betrayals of your own ideals, you can start to view them as necessary scaffolding. You built that scaffold to help you paint the ceiling. Now the painting is done and it's time to take the scaffold down. That's not a tragedy. It's not a moral failure. It's progress.
That is a profound shift in perspective. It moves you from moral judgment of yourself to functional understanding. I don't have to hate the version of myself that made those mistakes 5 years ago. I just have to recognize that its job is done and it's time to let it go.
And it also invites what the source calls cognitive reweighting. It's a challenge to us as modern people to use our amazing, powerful analytic minds, the ones that are so good at taking things apart, and consciously combine them with this ancient, holistic mode of cognition to start looking for the patterns, the relationships, the integrations, not just the isolated facts.
To see the story of our own lives not just as a series of random, disconnected events, but as a recursive model of interior structure.
Beautifully put. It's an invitation to read your own life with the same depth and symbolic literacy that these Gnostics read their sacred texts.
This has been a really wild ride. We've gone from a garden in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago straight into the architecture of the human mind. We've turned the ultimate villain into a necessary software update.
And in the process, I hope we've recovered a bit of respect for the incredible sophistication of our ancestors. They weren't just telling ghost stories around a campfire, they were engineering the soul.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's the final thought we want to leave you with. The source material mentioned that our modern systems excel at analytic differentiation, at taking things apart. But ancient systems excelled at integration, at putting things together.
Which feels like something we desperately need right now. We live in a very fragmented world. We need to remember how to put the pieces of ourselves and our world back together.
So the question we want to leave you with is this. In a world that is constantly analyzing, categorizing, and dividing you up into little pieces, what transitional ego structure are you holding on to right now? What part of your identity feels like the absolute non-negotiable truth, feels like this is who I am, but might actually just be the Judas in you, waiting to be kissed?
Is it your career, your political identity, your story about being a victim, your story about being a hero?
What is the thing in your life that needs to be betrayed, not destroyed, but lovingly surrendered, so that the next, truer version of you can finally emerge?
That is the question the Gospel of Judas asks, and it's a question only you can answer.
Thanks for diving deep with us.
See you in the next layer.